Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The memorial for Jack Mundey will commence shortly. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The memorial for Jack Mundey will commence shortly. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Bob Carr and I'm honoured to be your Master of Ceremonies today. Thank you for joining us here and on the live stream to honour the memory of a great man and his legacy for Sydney and for New South Wales. Before we begin, I ask that you please turn off your phones. I'd also like to acknowledge Mrs Judy Mundey, Brigadier Philip Bridie, the Honorary Aide-de-Camp representing the Governor-General of Australia, Her Excellency the Honourable Margaret Beasley, Governor of New South Wales, and Mr Dennis Wilson, the Honourable Gareth Ward, the Minister for Families, Communities and Disability Services, representing the Premier, Professor the Honourable Dame Mari Bashir, former Governor of New South Wales, Miss Jodie Mackay, the Leader of the State Opposition, the Right Honourable the Lord Mayor of Sydney, Clover, State and Federal Parliamentarians, past and present, former colleagues of Jack. I'd also like to invite Yvonne Weldon, the Chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, to welcome us to country.
Good morning, Mrs Judy Mundey, Governor, Mr Wilson, dignitaries, ladies, gentlemen, sisters and brothers. I stand before you on the land of Eora. I've grown physically on this land, but in my blood and always in spirit, I am Wiradjuri. I am Yvonne Weldon and I am a sovereign woman. I come from Cowra here in New South Wales. My ancestral bloodlines connect all along the lands and the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee Rivers. I am the elected chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land that we are on. I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to all First Nations, to you, and the many nations that are represented online today. Across this beautiful continent of ours, I understand you on the lands and the nations of tribes and clans. The First Nations of this continent are the oldest living culture of the world. We are gathered where ancient practices took place for over 60,000 years, not in this iconic structure, but the land that it stands. My people have always listened and learnt from each other, the environment, animals, elements, and our ancestors. We don't live in isolation of body, culture, spirit, land and water, because we are one, for in our blood it runs. We need to reflect upon the footsteps we're leaving to know where we're heading, shaping a society, a country we can be proud of. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders, and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal. I acknowledge Gadigal people whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. And with respect and honour to the late Jack Mundey, Judy Mundey, family and friends, could you all please pause briefly and reflect on Jack? What he stood for, what he kept rather than changed, what you still have because of Jack's trailblazing and his lasting legacy. On behalf of my family, I give you an offering of walking together, going in a direction my people, your people, and our people can share the path. We can move forward to bring about positive change, just as Jack did so on behalf of all of us. Know that in the footprints of my ancestors, we walk. Jack stood for many. Leave his prints as they stand. So let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. This always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. Thank you.
Yvonne, thank you for the welcome to Gadigal land. Jack served as a councillor on the City of Sydney from 1984 to 1987, so it's wonderful to host his state memorial service in this historic town hall, surrounded by the central business district, which witnessed his campaigns and BLF activism over the years. 3 blocks from what had been the union's headquarters in Sydney Trades Hall on Goulburn Street and Communist Party headquarters in Dixon Street. 2 blocks from the Pitt Street Uniting Church, saved by a green ban in 1972. At that church around that time, I was an ABC radio reporter when I met Jack. I would have loved a clairvoyant to have told me then, in my early 20s, that in 25 years' time I'd be Premier and would make one of my earliest decisions, his appointment as Chair of the Historic Houses Trust. What he was doing at that time was galvanising public opinion, jamming the environmental imperative into public discourse, catalysing social change, in particular, laying the basis for heritage protection and proper environmental planning. He was taking on the developers who, under Premier Askin, were levelling Sydney block by block for towers of startling uniformity in the country's most feverish property boom. Developer power was all that counted in Sydney until Jack spoke out. And today's program respects Jack Mundey in all respects, but plants him firmly in his social and political context. This is crucial, and we'd be doing an injustice to overlook it. Rosa Parks was a young black woman who in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, rejected an order from a bus driver to give up her seat to a white passenger. This implies she was a cheerful participant in a folk story and morality play about America's happy progress to race equality. She was, in fact, already a political activist, a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, trained in civil protest for social justice and racial justice. Her protest saw her fired from a job in a department store and the victim of death threats. Helen Keller is famous for her advocacy for the blind and the deaf, a public figure, a humanitarian. But to leave it at that is to lie by omission. She was a radical socialist who knew that men might be blinded in industrial accidents or through lousy medical care, and poor women who became prostitutes faced the danger of syphilitic blindness. She learned that social class controls opportunities in life and access to health. She was a radical who praised the Soviet Union. She was a member of the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, a proud American communist. Before he died, Dr. Martin Luther King was moving beyond the campaign for civil rights to embrace still more radical positions. Opposition to the Vietnam War, which had support from most Americans, and a demand for economic justice. Don't worry, this is not a history lesson. I'm making a point. The tribute to Jack Mundey, this tribute to Jack Mundey acknowledges he came out of the Australian working class. He was a farmer's son, an apprentice plumber, drawn to Sydney in 1950 to play football for Parramatta, then drawn to the mainstream building industry, seeing communists as people who wanted to make life better for ordinary workers. He was part of a radical team that took over the leadership of a pretty staid old union. And when modern planning legislation picked up where the green bans left off, Jack, Australia's most famous communist, recommitted himself to the urgency of the environmental campaign. He stood with all of us in this hall today in seeing global warming as existential threat. In this spirit, our first speaker is a construction worker. Dave Noonan is the National Secretary of Australia's largest construction union, the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union, CFMEU, having worked for the union for 25 years, previously with its antecedent, the Building Workers Industrial Union, BWIU. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Dave Noonan.
First of all, let me start by thanking Yvonne Weldon for that fantastic welcome to country. And I also wish to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Gadigal people, but also the lands of all of those around Australia who may be watching the video feed of this important meeting. Dear friends and comrades, I've been set an impossible task here today, but it's one that I take a great honour in being asked to do, and I'm not here because I knew Jack Mundey better than other people. I knew Jack, but there are many here that knew him longer than me and better than me. I'm proud to be part of this celebration of Jack's life as the leader of the Construction and General Division of the CFMEU, Jack's union, a union of which Jack was a life member. I've got 5 minutes to try and sum up and celebrate the life and times of Jack Mundey, and of course, as I said, it's impossible. But I'll tell you, I'm here, and in the spirit of Jack and of our union, I'm going to give it a crack. I really don't have the words at all, let alone in 5 minutes, to illuminate Jack's life and legacy as we stand in this beautiful city, in this beautiful hall. There's so much of Jack in the city of Sydney. You know, his life is written in brick and stone, in timber and concrete, in the beautiful historic buildings of the Rocks and Millers Point, of Glebe, Woolloomooloo, and of course the beautiful natural beauty of Kelly's Bush. It's written in the ongoing lives of the construction workers who escaped death and broken bodies and who fought the endless struggles for safety, the members of the BLF in New South Wales and all of the construction unions who fought to civilise an industry, to tame the merciless concrete jungle which took the lives and health and mobility of so many workers. There's an interview with Jack, it's a famous one you would have seen, because the BLF, of course, were always controversial, and that is a gift they have passed to its successor union, the CFMEU. But Jack is tackled by the interviewer about the resistance to one of the early BLF New South Wales campaigns for better wages and conditions, where the master builders attempted to use mass scab labour to undermine and break the campaign. As Jack said, the democratic right of working men and women to take action to improve their lives. And they tackle him about the fact that there was what they called vigilantes, which was people occupying jobs, work sites, to defend their jobs from the scabs who were used as thieves to take away their livelihoods because they dared to stand up for a better life. And Jack said, he pointed out the hypocrisy of that attack on the union when 23 building workers had died in Sydney the year before. You see, the builders' labourers, all of the construction workers faced terrible conditions on site, poor safety, amenities that you wouldn't give to an animal, and they were fighting to change that. And Jack pointed out the hypocrisy of launching such an attack on an organisation of working men and women when 23 people had died on construction sites the year before, and this had gone unremarked by the same media organisations that were so quick to attack the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation. Jack would be the first to say that he was part of a collective. There are well-known names of the New South Wales BLF, Bob Pringle, Joe Owen, so many others. There are too many to name, I think. But, of course, Jack was only part of that. But I think that it would be acknowledged by everybody that he was the leader and he was the person that right across the country and around the world came to personify the democratic egalitarian spirit of the BLF. But before they could do any of the things which we're going to talk about and hear about today, the green bans, the fights against apartheid, walking together with First Nation Australians against the vicious racism inflicted on our First Nation people, fighting for women to have the right to work in the building industry, the democratisation of a union, they had to fight a hard battle. And Bob somewhat generously called the leadership of the BLF before the communists and the left took control in the 50s as being staid. Well, I wasn't here. I wasn't born till some time after that. But I know enough, and I know enough people who were there to say that staid is probably not the word for them. They were a union of union officials, for union officials, and frankly of union officials for the bosses in many cases. And they fought hard to keep control of the union. You know, Jack came from the Atherton Tablelands to play rugby league for Parramatta, and I know rugby league's a hard game, but taking on the battle to take the BLF over for the rank and file must have been a harder fight. And they did face intimidation and blacklisting and all sorts of barriers, and also the attacks of the media even before they became the leadership of the union. But they worked collectively, they worked hard, they worked with great courage, and eventually the progressives prevailed in the New South Wales BLF. Jack became secretary in 1968, and immediately the union stepped up its campaign on the fundamentals that construction workers look for: safety on the job, the right to come home at the end of the day, sick pay for the workers and the families who are disadvantaged, when accident pay, amenities. They had a practice, I'm told, it is alleged, that when the amenities were filthy and incomplete, they were known to tip them into the hole at the start of the job to make the builder get some decent amenities in for the workers. This was seen as a great crime. I think the crime is subjecting workers to bad safety and appalling amenities, and it's a fight we have to fight even to today. But the fact that the BLF had that success, and they did it with other unions. I mean, there are some other trade union elders here today who I really do need to acknowledge. And I'm going to miss some people because I haven't seen everybody here, but Vic Fitzgerald, Secretary of the FEDFA, was part of the Green Band struggle, and I know Victor's here today, and he is a great inspiration to us all. My colleague, Lindsay Fraser, who was a BL back in those days and later Assistant National Secretary of the Construction CFMEU. I believe Sid Vaughan from the Operative Painters and Decorators Union is here, and Graham Childs, who was State Secretary of the FEDFA. Dick Whitehead is here as well, and many others, and if I've missed you, it's just because it's been hard to know who is here. But the point I'm trying to make is the fight for economic justice, for safety, for decent amenities that they fought and won. Every one of those battles was the foundation upon which the union was then able to convince the members that there were wider issues in society that they should be supporting. And it was done in a democratic way, and Jack always said and always told me that the actions of the union in the broader social issues needed to be founded in the issues in the concern and support of the members and of the wider community, and I think we can all take something from that, because we know they fought against apartheid. They demanded and won jobs for women in the building industry. They stood with First Nation Australians. But of course, the politics of the time was hard fought within the left, within the various communist and socialist movements of the time. There was great infighting. And there were, you can't pretend that there was a universal chorus of support for Jack and the New South Wales BLF in the broader trade union movement, because their actions were controversial there. I mean, in the Sydney Morning Herald and the rest of the newspapers and media, they were treated as pariahs. And of course, eventually, federal intervention came. the National BLF moved, and Gallagher moved in hard against the New South Wales BLF. Jack had stepped down and gone back on the job as part of limited tenure, a democratic principle to which he was committed. But he and dozens of other men and women, rank and file and officials of the New South Wales BLF were summarily expelled from the union. They lost their membership, they lost their tickets, and this was a terrible injustice, and one that I think weighs heavily on the heart and the history of my union. It was a great injustice. Even after fighting and winning against Norm Gallagher's expulsions and the federal union's expulsions in the court, Jack still didn't get his ticket back until years later, the formation of the CFMEU, and Jack became a life member and is still a life member of the CFMEU, and we are so proud that Jack Mundey was one of ours. I last saw Jack at the end of 2018. He was with Judy Mundey. They came to the delegates meeting of the New South Wales branch. I think we had 180, 200 delegates there maybe. As some of you know, Jack's voice had weakened in his illness as he got weaker physically. And he wasn't able to address the meeting. Judy addressed the meeting. And she expressed what Jack wanted to tell the meeting. And the respect and awe and love with which Jack Mundey and Judy Mundey were held by that group has to be seen to be believed, because first and foremost, before Jack was anything, he was a trade unionist. He was a proud member of our union, and I want to pay respect to Judy Mundey, not just for her partnership with Jack. Of course, Judy is, I think, one of the great activists of the Communist Party of Australia, a pioneering feminist, and so many other things as well. But in Jack's life and her partnership with Jack, I think at that last meeting that I was able to see, you could see what a wonderful thing it was. I have to wind up. I do want to say, before Bob winds me up, I do want to say again, we're proud of the fact we're Jack Mundey's union. We know that the things that stand now that are popular that Jack did and the New South Wales BLF did were not always popular. They were condemned, they were attacked, but they've stood the test of time. And even to this day, out on the building sites of Sydney, there are struggles still going on to get decent wages and conditions, to try and do something about the excessive hours of work. Every day we struggle for safety, our officials, our members on the job. The master builders, again, recently have been playing a terrible role in trying to de-unionise the industry, to casualise the industry. And that battle, that struggle, goes on, and it's a struggle that continues from the legacy of Jack Mundey. But also, can I say, if we go out to Parramatta now, Willow Grove, there's a beautiful historic building there, scheduled for destruction, and I'm so proud to say that it's the CFMEU and the building unions that stand with the community in support of that. That's the spirit of the Green Bands. That's the spirit of the New South Wales BLF. That's the spirit of Jack Mundey, and long may he live in the hearts and minds and imagination of this city, this nation, and globally. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dave Noonan. On either side of the stage, you see a portrait of Jack that has been loaned to us for today's service. On my right, the portrait's by Robert Hannaford, painted in 2001, as Jack was completing his term as chair of the Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales. Jack was at first lukewarm about the idea of the portrait, observing that people who were painted were top end of town, and that he, a builder's labourer, hardly fitted that category. But work proceeded smoothly after Mundey and Hannaford recognised a shared passion for the environment. So thank you to Sydney Living Museums for loaning us this work. And to my left is the portrait painted by his goddaughter, Justine Muller. This portrait is a 2020 Archibald Prize finalist and should be in the Archibald Tour, but the Art Gallery of New South Wales kindly allowed it to come to Sydney for this event. Justine says, Jack was a visionary who never lost sight of the beauty or potential in the old and the importance of history. His eyes are painted green as a symbol of his vision for a greener planet. My portrait is in homage to Jack. He may no longer be with us, but his legacy will live on forever. Meredith Bergman can be described as a Greenspan activist, a student at Sydney University who counted herself a friend of Jack's from the 1960s. There was a friendship born in anti-Vietnam War activity and protests against the visits of South Africa's racially segregated Springboks rugby teams. Later she wrote a PhD on green bands, well credentialed, because 40 boxes of the Union's archives ended up being saved in her living room. Her book has a title that says it all, beautifully chosen words, Green Bands, Red Power, the Saving of a City. From 1999 to 2007, Meredith served as President of the New South Wales Legislative Council. Meredith Bergman.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are here today on the land of the Gadigal of the Great Eora Nation and pay tribute to their elders. Jack Mundey was a truly significant figure in the history of world environmentalism, but he was also a giant in the story of the Australian labour movement. His leadership of the New South Wales Builders Labourers in the 60s and 70s showed what a truly progressive union could look like. He pioneered the concept of the social responsibility of labour. We all know his story, coming down from the Atherton tablelands. He became involved with the union rank and file when he found himself labouring on the tools. And as a consequence of that involvement with the union, he joined the Communist Party in the late 50s. He became increasingly influenced by the writings of the independent line Communist Party, whose leaders were writing about the need for greater democracy in union affairs. And Jack worked hard to put these democratic practices into his own union. By 1968, Jack was secretary of the Builders Labourers, which was a militant but very industrially weak union. But Jack realised that the first job of a union official was to raise the wages and working conditions that were present in that very dangerous and low-waged industry, which Dave has talked about. There were two important campaigns that happened soon after he became secretary. There was the 1970 Margins campaign, which raised labourers' wages, and then the 1971 accident pay strike. And both of those industrial issues really did cement the union membership's support behind the Jack Mundey leadership. Jack fought for the meaningful involvement of all members in union activities, including the large and diverse migrant membership. He introduced limited tenure of office, and he tied organisers' pay to the industry award, when at the time, of course, union officials had often been very highly paid. He also instituted the practice whereby officials didn't get paid at all during industry strikes. He was deeply involved in the issues of the 1960s, Vietnam, land rights, apartheid, and it was during the anti-war protests of 1968 that I first met him. I remember a solid, pugnacious union official with a head of 1970s bushy hair and very long side levers. I hope some of those photos were there on the screen. But what an inspiring orator. And I think that's the thing you keep remembering about Jack. He could actually inspire you to take action. Jack was an environmentalist before that term was even used. We didn't use environmentalist in those days. But the unique insight that Jack brought to the struggle was his view that workers should campaign around the social responsibility of labour. He believed that workers should think about the sort of work they do and the environment in which they live and work. We all know the story of the first green ban, the middle-class matrons, the battlers of Kelly's Bush, who turned to a communist union to save the last remaining bushland on the Parramatta River. In fact, Joan Kroll, one of those battlers, is here with us today. This June, it will be exactly 50 years since the placing of that first green ban. And we will once again remember Jack Mundey, Joe Owens, Bob Pringle, and the wonderful rank and file members of the New South Wales Builders Labourers, both men and women. And I see, hi Seamus, hi Pat. In imposing the green bans, the Builders Labourers were supported by a smaller building union, but they must always be remembered, the FEDFA, and I see that Vic Fitzgerald and Dick Whitehead are here. The bans were originally called black bans, but later, in a stroke of brilliance, Jack dubbed them green bans. Between 1971 and 1974, 54 green bans were imposed, mainly in the city of Sydney, and they held up $5 billion worth of building activity, that's in 1970s money terms. One of the important aims of the green bans was to protect the right of working people to live in the inner city. In addition to Kelly's Bush, the ban saved the Rocks and Woolloomooloo from being turned into high-rise executive suites. They saved Glebe from 2 major expressways, saved Centennial Park from being turned into a giant sporting complex. We keep forgetting these things. They saved Victoria Street, King's Cross from absolute demolition, saved Ultimo from an expressway, and saved the famous Opera House fig trees from becoming a car park. Individual buildings saved include the State Theatre and, of course, the Pitt Street Uniting Church, which Bob's just talked about, and the 3 old colonial buildings in Martin Place. Martin Place would just look totally different, except for the green bans. At the time of the 70s building boom, there was no heritage or environmental protection legislation. Voices against rapacious overdevelopment were very few. The media was relentlessly pro-development, and the only thing standing between historic streetscapes and the Wreckers' Ball was Jack and the Builders Labourers. Almost all bans ended up being physically defended, and many hundreds of resident activists and Builders Labourers got arrested and even jailed for this defiance. And hopefully you saw the pictures of Jack being quite cheerfully carried away from many of those demonstrations. The union, under Jack's influence, extended its activity to supporting the important social movements of the time too. A ban was placed to support a young gay activist who was expelled from a Macquarie University college. That was called the Pink Ban. And the union also supported women's studies at Sydney University. They put a ban on buildings at Sydney Uni until that course was allowed. And well before its time, it encouraged women into the building industry. And many women ended up being union officials and job delegates. Perhaps the union's most committed supporters were the young black activists of Redfern, who asked Jack and Bob Pringle to put a union ban on demolition of the block, which of course the union did. And this ban actually ended up with the Whitlam government handing over the block to the Redfern community. This action was often referred to as Australia's first successful land rights claim. Jack was a man of great charm and intellect. He loved an argument and rarely met his match. He was also very provocative, I might say. His articulate advocacy of progressive causes was a huge plus for the union movement generally. He believed that, quote, the enlightened middle class and the enlightened working class should come together in struggle. This meant that his friendships and working relationships were diverse and strategically important. He was always thinking, Jack. He was always a few steps ahead of everyone else. He was remarkably non-sectarian and had great friendships with Tom Uren and with Neville Wran. He even tolerated my membership of the Labor Party and was very fond of the young Anthony Albanese, who was one of Tom Uren's great supporters. When the Wran government was elected in 1976, Jack's influence was evident when the government passed environment and heritage protection legislation for the first time. It's extraordinary to think that we had to wait till the 70s to get that sort of protection. The union's green bands quickly became known around the world. Green band committees were formed by unions in Britain. Jack was invited to lecture in Europe and North America, and in 1976 he addressed the first United Nations conference on the built environment. And I must say that it was this international interest in the green bands and Jack's work that in fact led the publisher to reissue our book, the Green Band's Red Union, The Saving of a City. And I was getting emails from international scholars weekly until the reissuing of the book, because they found it so interesting. We keep forgetting that Jack Mundey and the Green Bands happened in Australia, and it is our really individual and important part of the world history of the environment movement. Jack wore his honours lightly. After receiving his second honorary PhD, he cracked to me, "What, only one PhD?" Vale, Jack, you are a great unionist, a great environmentalist and a great Australian. 50 years of being your friend wasn't enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. Next, we have highlights of the film Rocking the Foundations, A History of the New South Wales BLF and the Green Bands by director and producer Pat Fisk. In 1973, Pat came to Melbourne from the United States to work as a speech pathologist, but she never made it past Sydney and ended up working as a builder's labourer for 18 months at what felt like the most politically exciting time she'd ever experienced. She was deeply impressed by the stance the New South Wales BLF was taking with their green bands to protect the environment, people's affordable housing and our city's heritage. In 2001, she was awarded the prestigious Stanley Hawes Award for outstanding contribution to the documentary industry in Australia. She remains good friends with Jack Mundey. She remained good friends with Jack Mundey and many other BLs throughout their lives. Please enjoy this short clip from Rocking the Foundations.
For 5 years in the 1970s, the builders' labourers of New South Wales called a halt, took the centre stage. Call it what you will, they made history. Like thousands of others, I got involved with this union. In one way or another, we were swept up in what became a powerful social movement. When the builders' labourers put the environment and people ahead of their own jobs. And it was all the more extraordinary because it sprang from the least expected of places.
We tried to give strength to the rank and file to say that you are the union, and while of course you'd use the officials, in the main, you should do the work and bargaining at grassroots level.
We are really fighting for all workers throughout Australia because we feel in a country as rich as ours, well, those that create the wealth of the country shouldn't be victimised when they're off sick.
The decision by myself and other people in the leadership of the union that we would combat bureaucracy and entrenched officialdom by bringing in a rule which said that any official could only spend 2 3-year terms in office. That is, after 6 years, he must release power and allow other people to come in and take over that particular position.
The permanency inquiry called by the federal government commences on Monday in Melbourne, and it's certainly the most important inquiry that has ever taken place in the building industry. We find that the employers choosing younger men, we find it harder for workers, even once they reach the age of 40, to compete with younger workers. There's a tendency of the employers just to use up the workers, and when they get too old to climb the multi-storey buildings, they're thrown on the scrap heap.
Do you really care about these old buildings, or do they provide you perhaps with an issue that allows you to be a bit of a nuisance to the big developers?
No, I'm concerned very sincerely with issues like this. I'm really concerned about them. The big developers, I haven't got a great love for them because of their concern mainly for the quick dollar. And I think I speak for most Sydney people who believe that there should be more control over developers.
You wield a lot of power in doing what you're doing, don't you?
Yes, that is so. And I know that people at times fear that union leaders could become too arrogant, power drunk, and go too far. My answer to that is that the membership wouldn't allow that to happen anyway, and we'll stand judged on the specific issues that we have taken up to date.
Green bans were serious business and becoming known far and wide. The BLs were even called upon to stop work on a city office block because of a conservation issue in another state.
In this case, we responded to calls from conservationists thousands of miles away in North Queensland because a particular investor, one of the biggest investors in a proposed wood chip plant, has heavy investments in buildings in Sydney. And we told this particular developer that if he persisted with his intention of going ahead with this wood chip plant, there's every likelihood that this building in Sydney would not be completed. We were successful, and the particular investor said that he would not go ahead with his investment in the proposed wood chip plant.
If I could have a reserve instruction, I'd ask you for some bids.
First of all, the Builders Labourers Federation will not engage in any demolition or construction of any redevelopment on that site unless the 5 small businessmen who are now there, business people, are given reasonable rentals by the new owner. If ironclad guarantees are given to that effect, we will engage in any redevelopment that the new owner so requires. So for that reason, I think we should let any intending purchaser know of those important facts.
I'm sure you have, sir, and I'm sure they're fully aware of those points because it's very well publicised. We seem to be reading about it every day. All right, what am I bid?
The developers here would dearly love, or would very much like a change in the leadership, to a leadership that would cooperate with them, and the opposition have said that they'll do this, that they'll review the green ban. So therefore the developers have an open interest in it, and then to complicate matters further, the federal leadership of the Builders Labourers, a so-called Maoist grouping led by Norm Gallagher in Melbourne, are openly supporting this group as well. So we've got, one might say, the twin evils attacking the Builders Labourers in New South Wales.
Not like you, Mr Mundey.
I'm lighter than you anyway.
Not like you. I thought you'd be a gentleman war.
No longer can unions only be content with battling around economic issues. As long as unions exist, of course, their primary role is to struggle against the capitalists to get higher wages and better conditions. But then again, as I've said before, it's not much good winning a 35-hour week if we're going to choke to death in planless and polluted cities
where rents are too high, where ordinary people can't live. And so there will never, ever be any reconstruction. There will never, ever be any reconstruction, any rejuvenation, regeneration of this area until such time as the residents receive ironclad guarantees that people in the low income brackets, workers, can afford to live in these areas. No longer are workers going to be driven out of cities.
Which is altogether fitting now for me to welcome to the stage the Trade Union Choir to sing Solidarity Forever. Due to COVID restrictions, it's my duty to ask you to refrain from singing along. The Trade Union Choir.
There can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weak and the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Lash us into serfdom and would crush us with his might. Is there anything left for us to do but organize and fight? For the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than the hoard of gold, greater than the might of armies magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth the new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. For the union makes us
Thank you to the Trade Union Choir. Clover Moore has been the Lord Mayor since 2004. That makes her the longest-serving Lord Mayor of Sydney since the creation of the city in 1842. She is the first popularly elected female Lord Mayor of Sydney. She was an independent member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly from 1988 to 2012. Clover Moore's absorbed and championed the pioneering activism, the humanisation of the urban landscape that is the Jack Mundey heritage. In fact, Jack's advocacy paved the way for all Clover's done in her strong and unique career in state and local politics, building communities, accountability in government, heritage protection, above all, sound planning. Please join me in welcoming the Right Honourable Lord Mayor Clover Moore.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome everyone to Town Hall for this very, very important event. I too would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders both past and present, and also acknowledge the people of the very many nations who live in our city and thank Yvonne Weldon for her welcome. I'd like to also acknowledge the speakers who are here today and the very many distinguished guests that Bob has named and the fellow travellers of Jack Mundey. I also acknowledge Judy, lawyer, feminist and Jack's steadfast partner in work as well as in life, and we are glad to honour you both here today at Town Hall. What a champion we had in Jack. He had an unerring sense of justice and fearless commitment to whatever cause he involved himself in. Safe and decent working conditions for builders' labourers, the preservation of historic buildings, proper housing for Aboriginal people, opposing toll roads while fighting for more public transport, and increasingly the conservation of our precious natural environment. And it was so fantastic seeing Rocking the Foundations, and so sad really to see that we're still fighting the same battles about ensuring that we can keep affordable housing in our city. The battles that Jack fought are continuing. In 1971, the first historic green ban in Kelly's Bush spawned a powerful movement. By all accounts, the Hunters Hill ladies were initially dubious about joining forces with a communist union leader, but like so many people after them, found themselves won over by Jack's conviction and by his infectious humour and charm, and as Meredith said, his amazing oratory. These were the days, as Meredith has indeed said, before heritage legislation, the days of wholesale, even gleeful destruction, when vehicles of one company in the building industry proudly boasted the logo, "Wheelin' the Wrecker." In 1984, I was pleased to support Jack's candidacy for the City Council, and we served as independents together from 1984 to 1987. And in that time, Jack chaired, for a year of that time, Jack chaired the city's planning committee, much to the alarm of Sydney developers. But the developers found themselves up against people power in Jack's office, usually crowded with supporters and volunteers, and many from the labour movement and the building industry. When in 1987 the council was unceremoniously ousted, Jack found no shortage of other battles to wage. And how much of Sydney do we owe to him? The builders' labourers' policy was to impose a ban only at the request of the local community involved, thus fostering the growth of the resident action groups and demonstrating to people that people power, that they had strength when they organised as people power. The groundswell of voices eventually encouraged the Rand government to introduce the state's first environmental legislation. Following the success of the Kelly Bush campaign, other community groups formed and new battles were joined. The Rocks, Woolloomooloo, Darlinghurst, Glebe, Callum Park. There were precious buildings saved in central Sydney, at Parramatta and in Newcastle. How would our city be, had those places been lost? A more than usually pompous editorial in the Sydney Morning Herald had once advised Jack and the builders' labourers to confine themselves to demolishing the old and putting up the new and often tatty. Thankfully, the union ignored the advice. There was a great collaboration developed between the builders' labourers and the National Trust through Jack and the Trust's then director, John Morris, known as Ginger. They met at first in the Royal George Hotel because Ginger felt his more conservative members wouldn't want him seen entering the union headquarters, while Jack felt the Trust headquarters weren't a natural fit for him either. But the two men hit it off and worked together for many years, and Jack eventually was nominated as the National Trust Living Treasure. Over his time, his influence spread from Sydney to places across Australia and beyond. In 1980, the concept of citizen action and the green bands prompted a young politician, Petra Kelly, to co-found Germany's Green Party after a visit to Australia. That in turn prompted the formation of green parties in other countries, including our own, under the leadership of Bob Brown. Jack rightly received many accolades: honorary doctorates, life membership of the Australian Conservation Foundation, a certificate of appreciation from the Australian Institute of Travel and Tourism for his work to preserve the rocks. And in 2017, the President's Award from the Australian Institute of Architects, possibly the only time it was ever given for not constructing a building. He maintained his commitment to the end, most recently lending his voice and presence to the campaign to Save the Sirius building, as committed as ever. The building's been saved, but not the low-income housing tenants to live in it, sadly. All of us will miss Jack, and all of Sydney remains in his debt. So Vale Jack Mundey, and strength to Judy. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, for your speech and for hosting us in this great historic hall. Across the party political divide, I've admired Lee Rhiannon for standing up to bullies who have taken offence at her position on, among other things, Palestinian rights. Her activism goes back to May 1965, the month that Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced that conscripts would be committed to the Vietnam War. The anti-war movement responded by organising sit-downs by its members in Wynyard and in Martin Place. Campaigning with him, Lee Rhiannon confirms Jack Mundey's commitment to radical politics. She herself went on to serve in the Legislative Council as a Greens Party member from 1999 to 2010, and then 2011 to 2018 as a Green in the Australian Senate. Join with me in welcoming Lee Rhiannon.
Thank you to Yvonne for the very moving welcome to country. And I do acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay tribute to their history, their culture, and their many struggles for justice. How moving has it been to hear the speeches and to see Jack come alive, and reminds us how much we miss him. So it's also so excellent to be together today with Judy and friends and comrades. And I'd also like to thank Bob for his introductory remarks. I thought he so captured the essence of Jack and what he stood for so passionately. And I think it's a reminder of how Jack will continue and does continue to inspire young and old. The Green Band era alone would be an exceptional accomplishment for one lifetime, but Jack packed in so much more. The role he played in building the great social movements of the last half of the 20th century is to be honoured and built upon. A frequently asked question about Jack's work is, how did he win the active support of so many? How did he win the support of often poorly educated labourers for environmental, feminist, LGBTI and international solidarity campaigns? The answer is education and involvement of union members, and most importantly, Jack's ability to convince people to support just causes. Rebuilding the Builders Labourers Federation, as we've heard from Meredith, as a democratic members-run union was a major achievement of Jack's. It was certainly one that laid the basis for the Green Bands and the social movement unionism that came to characterise Jack's political work for his whole life. As well as being a rugby league player, a labourer and a union organiser, Jack was a left intellectual, an intellectual who frequented the barricades. Jack widely promoted the concept of social responsibility of labour. He argued that workers had the right to insist that the work they undertook was not harmful to the environment or to people, and that society could move past the destructive practices inherent in capitalism. Jack's other great contribution in terms of analysis and practical involvement was his commitment to social change movements. We see this in his work to build broad, cross-class alliances, and when necessary, to use direct action to advance radical demands. The latter was well illustrated in Jack's contribution to the anti-Vietnam War struggle. In May 1965, the Menzies government decided to send Australian conscripts to fight alongside US troops in that shocking war. Jack was part of a small group of protesters who recognised the need to respond with more radical action. On the night of the Menzies announcement, Jack Mundey, Bill Brown and Bruce Steele were arrested in a sit-down blocking traffic in the CBD. History was made on that occasion. This is thought to be Australia's first political sit-in. The protest and similar arrestable actions helped build the anti-Vietnam War struggle into the massive movement that within a decade saw Australia withdraw from the war in Vietnam. Jack's Green Band work and political activities were influenced by the constructive collective work of the Communist Party of Australia. Jack had joined the party in the 50s and in the 1970s was elected president. He was a strong advocate for socialism with a human face. In the early 1990s, Jack joined the Greens. Years earlier, he had had a role in the name of this new left party. German peace activist Petra Kelly was inspired by the Green Bands and Jack's work when she visited here in the 1970s, as Clover laid out. She was looking for a name for a new German left party. In 1980, with Petra Kelly as a driving force, the German Green Party was formed, and a few years later, the name came back to Australia with the first Greens Party formed in this country just a couple of kilometres where we are today. Jack was an active Greens member, supporting the party's many campaigns, standing in elections, writing endorsements for candidates and giving out how to vote cards. Jack actively supported progressive campaigns up to his late 80s, and in 2016 he was involved in another Green Band win. This time at Bondi, where he spoke at a press conference with CFMEU construction officials when they announced a green ban on Bondi Pavilion. The ban had been requested by the local community to stop a Liberal privatisation plan. The principles that Jack had advanced decades earlier of strong community engagement, rank-and-file union support, and democratic and direct action were successfully utilised to win this campaign. It is fitting I conclude with Jack's own words. In 2011, at an event to mark 40 years since the first Green Band at Kelly's Bush, Jack stated, "If we are going to have a 21st century, and if socialism is going to be successful, it should be directed towards harmonising with nature and other living species. Capitalism cannot be humanised." Jack's words. I extend my condolences to Judy Mundey and thank her for her support and love she shared with Jack, a partnership that was the key to so much of Jack's life and what we celebrate today and continue to enjoy in this beautiful city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. I'd now like to welcome to the stage opera singer Stella Zaguris to perform Amazing Grace. Stella, I speak for everyone when I say what a beautiful performance, and thanks for being with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Watts was director of the Historic Houses Trust from 1981 to 2008, I was privileged to work with him as Minister for Planning and Environment and later as Premier when I was able to present him with a proud political appointment, making Jack Mundey the new chair of the authority that he ran. Please welcome a distinguished New South Wales public servant, Peter Watts.
Thank you, Bob, very much. And I, too, acknowledge the Gadigal people of the inauguration and thank Yvonne Weldon very much for that very warm welcome to country. Well, we've all met very many wonderful people, I'm sure, in our lives, some well known, others not. For me, Jack Mundey was the finest human being I've ever met and am ever likely to. Mary Robinson and Mary McAleese, both former presidents of Ireland who I had the great privilege of meeting on a number of occasions, come a very close equal second. I came to know Jack, as Bob has said, when he was appointed chair of the Historic Houses Trust in 1995, and it was a brilliant choice, Bob, thank you. By then, Jack was 65. As director of the trust and 20 years his junior, I had a very close personal working relationship with him for 6 years that grew into a very warm and cherished friendship that continued until his death. Like many of you, I came to love Jack deeply. Though we were very different people, we shared similar values and we were both country boys making our way in the city. Yes, we all loved and admired Jack for his great work to protect the built and natural environments. I loved him because he was the greatest humanist I've ever known. He lived his values and he made huge personal sacrifices to do so. He was a true visionary. He understood, as one writer put it recently, that the struggles both for social and environmental justice are part of the same broader project to preserve human dignity in the face of unrestrained development. He changed the way, as we have heard, the way politicians and the community thought about social and environmental issues. He empowered the community, and in doing so, he encouraged and enabled politicians to take action. He was a true progressive on so many fronts, as we've heard from others today. Perhaps in his mid-60s, when I first met him, some of that fire may have dissipated, but certainly none of his passion, nor certainly his principles. He joked that his appointment to chair one of the state's main cultural institutions gave him a new respectability, and perhaps it did. He was both amused and delighted by that. Certainly his appointment gave him a platform, a platform for his personal views and his profile that had perhaps been lost in the recent decade or so. During his term as chair of the trust, we acquired, amongst other places, Government House. All of a sudden, Jack was effectively the proprietor of the house that had been the leading house in New South Wales society for some 150 years. He wasn't the governor, though perhaps he should have been. He would have been a brilliant one. In fact, one of his greatest fans was the then Governor, Murray Bashir, and I'm so delighted she's here today. She once leaned over and whispered to me when Jack was speaking at an event, and Dame Murray, I hope I'm not committing an indiscretion by revealing this, but you said to me on that occasion, "We all love that man. The very best people are a good mix of red and green." Being the proprietors of Government House meant that Judy and I had to persuade and even wrangle him into a formal dinner suit on more than one occasion when he needed to attend and sometimes even host trust events being held at Government House. For someone who regarded the tie as a symbol of capitalism, that was quite a task, both philosophically and practical. All I can say is thank goodness for clip-on bow ties. But Jack did it with good grace and good humour. He, of course, revelled in the building conservation projects we were engaged in, the Mint in Macquarie Street, Rouse Hill Estate, Government House, and many, many others. As a chairman, Jack was perfect. He might not have known much about the history of colonial furniture or the conservation of works of art and the like, but he was principled, and he understood and respected expertise and scholarly principle, the need for good governance and management, and to listen very carefully. And most of all, of course, he understood the need to connect with the broader community. Exhibition opening nights, particularly at the Museum of Sydney, changed character, and we were delighted to welcome many of Jack's old union mates who turned up in numbers. And the proportion of beer to Chardonnay changed quite dramatically. Jack played from the heart as well as the head. He instinctively knew what was right. He examined everything through the lens of what would truly benefit the community. He took particular interest always in the many people who worked at and for the Trust, staff members, members of the Friends organisation, and the many hundreds of volunteers. He attended their endless events, usually speaking off the cuff and with the warmest and wisest of messages, delivered in his characteristically gentle, direct, witty, but powerful voice, and always with the characteristic and ample dose of self-deprecation. I saw his special genius on display when he was given an honorary Masters of Environment, which was created specially for him at Sydney University, and he gave the occasional address to the graduating students. You could have heard a pin drop in the Great Hall. His message that their privileged education should be used for the public good was simple but mesmerising. He had a way of connecting with people across disciplines, education levels, class, age, gender, race and religion, and even, dare I say it, political persuasion. Jack almost always touched you when he talked to you. He held a hand or an arm, put his hand on your shoulder. It made for a very visceral connection, and it came naturally and without contrivance. And it was quite disconcerting when you were driving him. As a community, we crave for leaders with his values, his wisdom, his courage, his honesty, his integrity, his simple kindness, his generosity, and his deep and natural humility. I saw him on many occasions disarm the rich and powerful with that quiet dignity and common sense. I spent a lot of time with Jack when we worked together. We must have attended hundreds of events together. It was like being with a pop star. People would ask me if they could shake his hand, speak to him, or just touch him. A few weeks ago, I saw Adam Goodes in a building, and I think if I felt what Jack's admirers had felt. I wanted to say thank you, to acknowledge Adam Goodes for his personal suffering, to wish him well, and to assure him there were so many who had a profound respect and admiration for his courage and his dignity, for what he had endured and what he had achieved, and for being true to himself. Similarly with Jack. As Mungo McCallum put it so well, Jack Mundey was one of those rare species who always knew the outcome, not the credit, was what was important. Such people are very rare indeed. I only ever heard two people criticise him. One was the director of a major bank, so I say no more. The second was my mother, I'm ashamed to say. She was a country girl from Victoria, never voted anything other than Country Party, and she was staying with us in Sydney. I told her Jack and Judy Mundey were coming for dinner. Isn't he that comic fellow? She chided. Yes, I responded. Then don't expect me to stay for dinner with him. What would your father think? She stayed and was charmed, as everyone was. Thank goodness we can still have Judy at our table. Judy shared Jack's life for over 55 years. They were true soulmates. They were true soulmates, sharing the same interests and the same values. Judy brought up Jack's son, Michael, and we should remember him today. She brought him up as her own until Michael's tragic death at age 22, the same age his mother had died. Jack was often absent, and as Judy said to me last week, well, one of us had to be home when the other was being arrested. Judy supported Jack in all his endeavours, bringing to the partnership an enormous knowledge, keen intellect and abundant common sense. She shared Jack's deep commitment to humanity, and we all offer her our deepest sympathies. Jack Mundey's legacy lies partly in this room, in all of us who learnt from this exceptional man, and it lies without in the many places he helped save, in the attitudes he changed, the movements he supported, and in the example he set. Thank you.
Peter, thank you for that moving tribute. They met when he became an organiser and she was secretary in the office of the union. Theirs has been a lifelong partnership united by a commitment to fairness. And Judy Mundey herself was able to experience this thrust for social justice in the Australian story, shaped by reformist politics, because she benefited from it. When Gough Whitlam abolished university fees, she was liberated to get the education she never had as a girl. And she studied arts at Macquarie University, then law, with the ambition to work in legal aid, which she did. She knew better than anyone the Jack Mundey we've been honouring today, the young fighter for workers' rights on building sites, the radical champion fighting the Vietnam War and apartheid, the brave voice against developer power and the corruption of the system, our national living treasure, the hero to those who wanted to save the parklands, the bush, the heritage buildings, the very character of their city. She knows best, this champion who kept fighting for all these things until he was lost to us on May 10, 2020. So please join me in a warm welcome to Judy Mundey.
Thank you. I acknowledge we meet on the land of the Gadigal people and pay respects to their elders past and present, and I thank Yvonne for welcoming us to their country. Jack was born on the Atherton tableland in far north Queensland. He was the fourth of 5 children. The first 3 were girls, Josephine, Bernice and Dorothea. Younger brother Bill came along later. His parents owned a dairy farm and his mother also taught music. Jack's mother died when he was 6 years old. The young family was also impacted by the Depression, as were many others, and during that period they lost the farm. His father became a share farmer and later an auctioneer. Jack sometimes referred to his childhood as being poverty-stricken. Given a chance, he'd talk about how as a child he would jump from cowpat to cowpat to warm his feet when rounding up the cows in the frosty early mornings, do the milking, then ride his horse to school where he'd fall asleep on the desk from tiredness. It wasn't quite that Dickensian. They lived on a farm. There was always enough food, but as importantly, the Mundeys had a rich family life. They were great talkers, were widely read, politically aware, lovers of poetry, and were part of a close-knit community on the tableland. Jack and his friends played cricket, football, boxing, and swam in the river where there were platypus. He attended local primary schools and was then sent away to the Marist Brothers boarding school in Cairns for his high school education. He didn't remain at that school for long. There was nothing wrong with the school. He wasn't very keen on the discipline, but the draw of the family and life on the tableland was strong, and he returned to Malanda and the family and his sports, although he gave up boxing after suffering a shoulder injury when fighting an older, more experienced opponent. He considered himself lucky to have suffered the injury, given his growing awareness of the damage boxing can inflict over time, and became a firm opponent. He continued to follow football and cricket all his life. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of cricket, but it was football that brought him to Sydney. He was offered a trial with the Parramatta Club, gave up the plumbing apprenticeship he was partway through, and moved here to take up the offer. In due course, other family members followed, except for Dorothy, who'd already married and started a family. First Bill came, then Bernice, and then Josie and their father moved to Sydney, and they always remained close, as did the growing Queensland family. When he arrived in Sydney, Jack played football, but it wasn't all football and cricket. Jack loved literature and music, and the first time he took me out, it was to a ballet. The second time, mind you, it was to a Ban the Bomb march. The French were still letting off testing nuclear bombs in the Pacific. Between football matches, Jack worked. There were a few other jobs, then he obtained work as a builder's labourer. Working conditions were primitive and unsafe, and the pay poor. He joined the union. The leaders were corrupt and did little for the members, so he joined the rank and file organisation, which was trying to clean up the union. Eventually, the rank and file won through. Jack became an organiser and in 1968, secretary of the union. He was a reluctant candidate for the secretaryship. He was a member of the Communist Party and felt that might jeopardise the election. But it's not overstating it to say Jack had been central to the achievements of the union to that time. He was persuaded to run and was elected. Jack had joined the Communist Party because he was inspired by many of the ideals held by communists and socialists of a world free from racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism, a more egalitarian society informed by a concern for humanity and social justice, where opportunity and a good quality of life was afforded to all. His environmental concerns were enhanced by reading Rachel Carson, Paul and Anne Ehrlich, Barry Commoner and others, and his respect for and the need to protect the environment and other species grew. Jack was never motivated by aims of self-enrichment or personal ambition. He utilised his position or influence for public good and social advancement. When Aboriginal people at Wave Hill Station in the Northern Territory went on strike, exposing the utterly undefensible situation where they were paid in rations while working on their own land, never ceded to the Vesties or anyone else, it seemed natural for the union to bring 2 members of the Gurindji to Sydney to help publicise their plight and to raise money to assist their struggle. When gay rights activists came to the union seeking help when a gay student was expelled from university accommodation because he was gay, it seemed right for the union to help defend his rights, and he was reinstated. Of course, these sorts of actions and the environmental and heritage issues could not have been undertaken without the overwhelming support of the union members. This support arose from the early campaigns to civilise the building industry, as they called it, to bring about decent pay and conditions on the job, to democratise the union and give the members some dignity and pride. They weren't all raging environmentalists or gay rights supporters, but they supported the leadership. I like the story about the builder's labourer who said that when he told his wife about the issue at Macquarie University supporting the rights of this gay student, she said incredulously, "You've stopped work because of what?" But that action contributed to raising awareness about gay rights, although it took some time for the rest of Australia, but we finally caught up with the builders' labourers on the issue. Jack was involved in the major political and social issues of the day, including the anti-apartheid campaign against the racially selected Springbok tour, a campaign that helped to bring an end to the racist, inhuman apartheid regime in South Africa. He actively opposed our disgraceful involvement in the Vietnam War, which caused such monumental ongoing harm both to Vietnam and to our troops who were sent there, many as conscripts. He marched against our unjustified and illegal involvement in the Iraq War and opposed sending our troops to Afghanistan with all the tragedy and misery those wars have left in their wake. But he was also strongly critical of Soviet troops going into Czechoslovakia. That invasion of Czechoslovakia put an end to what was known as the Prague Spring. It was the most promising hope that the ideals of socialism might actually be implemented in at least that country. They hadn't been anywhere else. But that Soviet invasion put paid to that. When I met Jack, he was a widower with a 2-year-old son. The worst thing that ever happened to us in our lives was the death of our dear Michael, aged 22, when he was a passenger in a motor vehicle accident. My admiration for Jack grew when somehow, after our crushing personal tragedy, he was still able to be involved in and able to respond to issues that were important: social justice, human rights, heritage, ecology. Over his life, he continued to be involved in more campaigns than I could possibly mention here, even when in quite poor health, such as a month before he turned 90, attending the massive and marvellous school student rally to draw attention to the need for our country to seriously and urgently address climate change. As a person, he was generous. It wasn't always convenient. We were going home one night from town when I noticed the friend walking with us to the station was carrying a suitcase. I asked him if he was going away somewhere. "Yes," he said, "to your place. Jack said I could." He'd been unwell and needed somewhere to recuperate. About 9 weeks later, an assessment was made, evidence-based of course, that possibly he'd recuperated sufficiently to look for a more permanent abode, the evidence being his capacity to consume a fair amount of alcohol in the local pub each night. It wasn't the only time. Jack had been invited to lecture in England by the London School of Environmental Studies because of the green bans. We were to share a flat in London with somebody we'd not met before. We'd known him for about 3 minutes before Jack invited him to come and stay with us if he ever came to Australia, which he did. That is, come to Australia and stay with us for the best part of a year. It was nice to have him, of course, but But in retrospect, it was probably good our place was so small, otherwise Jack may well have tried to reduce the homelessness problem by inviting people from the street in. Aside from being generous, Jack was highly intelligent, usually modest, wore the many awards lightly, seeing them as a public affirmation of heritage, environmental or industrial achievements, had a marvellous sense of humour, was quick-witted, courageous and calm in the face of some difficult and unpleasant situations, had an easy rapport with people, he liked people. He was ethical, always optimistic, he was inspired and inspiring. His life helped enrich the lives of others. He leaves an ongoing legacy. He was loving and much loved. And I've been the beneficiary of a warmth of feeling for Jack since he died. People have been kind and supportive to me. It's been readily forthcoming and it's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. The last item in today's proceedings is a photo montage set to the John Lennon song, Imagine. The photos you'll see span Jack as a child through his career into his latter years. The lyrics, of course, speak for the world Jack wished.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, or brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one.
Well, friends, that brings the memorial service to a close. As you walk down the steps of this historic building, think of the rocks, think of Woolloomooloo, think of the church around the corner and all the precincts and streetscapes we owe to a football-playing farmer's son from the Atherton Tablelands who was open to one very big idea. The environment is under threat and we should mobilise to save it. In the 2020s, we live with a huge threat beyond anything that might have been dreamt of in the 1970s. The threat of global warming beyond what the Paris Agreements contemplated, and the terrible inability of humanity to mobilise to stop emitting the carbon and the methane in time to rein this process in. Jack's voice and spirit, captured in the photographs and the words we've exchanged today, sends a message. The very personality of the man we honour cries out, urging us to bring forward the necessary action on climate. It's a memorable tribute we've paid today, but think of his spirit urging us to commemorate his life by redoubling our efforts in the 2020s to save a battered old planet, struggling with mega fires and record temperatures and wild climate events and species loss. Not for a moment would Jack Mundey want us to cease the battle, to stop struggling and agitating. The environment was his religion, and fighting for it his democratic life and legacy. I invite everyone to stand while Mrs Mundey, followed by the official party, makes its way out of the building. Please wait for further instructions by the ushers before departing. Thanks for turning up today.